I was raised Unitarian Universalist, as you may know, but we had a Jewish family and friends, observant Jewish family and friends, so I attended my first Passover Seder as a child, and it seemed to me to be kind of like a terrifying drinking game. With the recitation of all the plagues God visited upon the Egyptians for their crimes. Actually, it was the Pharaoh's crime of enslaving them, of enslaving the Jewish people. We got to do the fun things like throwing the drops of wine from our goblets onto our plates and eating those strange symbolic items, the bitter herbs, the horseradish, and the dreaded gefilte fish, and the wine, even for the children. 4 full glasses prescribed at certain points in the celebration of Jewish survival. But it all seemed so far away, 3,500 years or so, and slavery in our own nation abolished way back in 1865. I didn't know then about Jim Crow and about what a sham abolition really had been for enslaved Africans in America. So the concept of a people being delivered from slavery didn't seem really relevant to me. It felt much more relevant to the African American experience, to a people who had known the pain of enslavement much more recently in history. So I assumed it was all over because we were modern people, because the world was a place of progress and morality, and where if there were people in chains anywhere, my country would send in an army to liberate them. I just had no idea. Slavery, of course, is not over. The definition of slavery is recognized the same way today as it has been throughout all of human history. And this is Kevin Bale's definition. He's the co-founder of Free the Slaves. And the definition is someone who is forced to work without pay under threat of violence and unable to walk away. So in everyday language, we tend to use nowadays another term for slavery. We use the term human trafficking. So we're talking about forced prostitution, child soldiers, forced and bonded labor, the use of children in the international drug trade. Free the Slaves estimates that slavery is a $150 billion industry for traffickers every year. Something like, it's impossible to really know, but something like 40 million people all over the globe are enslaved. 50% or so of those are doing labor. 12.5% are doing sex work, enslaved in sex work. 25% of all of those are under the age of 18. The workers who made the dress and the sweater that I am wearing today probably make $2 a week, work under brutal conditions, and live in abject poverty. In an introduction to a recent book on slavery, Gloria Steinem wrote, "Yes, most forms of slavery are illegal, at least on paper, but some cultures normalize them by caste or debt servitude or sexual practice. Others create laws but don't enforce them, may pay or supervise officials so poorly that bribery becomes a way of life. And most of the enslaved themselves are too dependent, invisible, or fearful of reprisal to speak, even supposing they would be listened to." When Robert Kraft was arrested, I guess last month, for soliciting prostitution at a sketchy massage joint in Florida, it was easy to snicker about the sleaziness of his arrest, but more important for us was to ask, who were the sex workers? Under what conditions were they employed, if at all? Or were they trafficked, as so many sex workers are? So we're starting to be more aware of this human trafficking issue and to ask those important questions. I'm starting to ask those questions myself in the course of my daily life. I used to go to those discount foot spas in the area, Seemed so great to get a $30 hour-long massage for $30, thinking like, whoa, because most massage therapists charge at least twice that, $70, $80, $90 for an hour massage. So I'm thinking like, yeah, bargain. And then I realized, reading an article about trafficking right here in Massachusetts, I'm like, wait a minute, $30 for an hour of work, and I'm pretty much sure that Chinese worker who doesn't speak any English is not getting much of that money. I don't know how much they're getting at all, in fact. And I'm pretty sure that they have no hourly guaranteed income, no benefits whatsoever. They obviously don't have a labor union to protect them from exploitation. And I learned that they're very likely living in squalid conditions, paying back the person who got them into the US, paying back that person for an undefined period of time with really interestingly, shifting interest rates and no guarantee of ever being free of that debt. That's like down the street from me, right? It's the new slavery. And I'm afraid it's all around us, but mostly invisible to our eye. And it's painful, therefore, to think about interconnectedness in this way. When Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about the inescapable network of mutuality, well, it turns out that network isn't always a beautiful and actual mutual thing. It's in fact supported by millions of enslaved men, women, and children. Those plagues. The ancient story says that Moses went to Pharaoh, whose court he'd grown up in, and said, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh was hard-hearted. He wasn't willing to give up his labor force. A lot of pyramids to build, a lot of structures to build, a lot of Old Navy and Gap and Walmart and H&M and Target clothes to get into the stores for the spring sales. The profit margin is too sweet. And so God intervened and sent the plagues: frogs, locusts, blood running in the rivers, boils on the skin of the Egyptians, dead children. It's very disturbing, and it certainly makes an impression. I don't like that punishing, murdering God. I'm assuming you also have a problem with a God concept like that yourselves, and that you are as offended and angry as I am when some pious fraud like Pat Robertson says that God sent a tornado or a hurricane or some other natural disaster to this or that city as a punishment for homosexuality or liberal politics, and that sort of nonsense. And he does that regularly. It's absolutely ludicrous and harmful, and I utterly reject it. But at the same time, I have to kind of appreciate that the most powerful creative force in the universe is adamantly on the side of justice and freedom, because I believe that it is. I believe that freedom and liberation are coded into creation, particularly in the form of individual human conscience and human moral freedom. So in this framework, I can really get behind the Exodus story as a dramatic illustration of holy intervention against human sin and greed. As a person of Jewish heritage, I can embrace it as a story of my ancestors. But as a privileged white American woman, I can hear it with sadness, grief, and remorse as a warning against allowing my life to be made comfortable by the enslaved labor of other human beings. In other words, sometimes in the Exodus story, I am the Jew being delivered out of slavery, and sometimes I am the Egyptian looking the other way and going about my nice life, while my Pharaoh and his armies lift the lash against people more powerless than I. We don't need vengeful God to send plagues. We know what they are: environmental degradation, an epidemic of depression, anxiety, struggle for meaning, suicide, worship of guns, putting faith in violence and militarism, dead children and teenagers, addiction, whales washed up on the shores, the disappearance of entire species, homelessness, poverty, racism, all the isms, generational family abuse. No heavenly liberator sent those things. They are the result of an interconnected web of exploitation of our planet and its people, just as horrible as any of those ancient plagues. Pharaoh's armies pursued the fleeing Israelites, and so it says, God parted the waters of the Red Sea to allow the captives to go free and drowned Pharaoh's armies. Whatever miracle of liberation comes today, if it does, it will not be as cinematic as that or as simple. When the seas part in our times, everyone goes under. And we know that it's not the armies actually, but the world's poorest and most vulnerable who get swept away first. And so, how does liberation come? Not through one amazing event, not through supernatural miracles, but through many small events, beginning with the small miracle of one human being, or a few at a time, hearing the cries of the distressed earth and oppressed people, maybe across the globe, maybe in the mirror. I'm wondering, how can I help? What can we do? How can we analyze, question, interrupt, and disrupt systems of harm, exploitation, and abuse? With each such conversion, the sea begins to part, so that the hurt, the heartbroken, the exploited, and the abused can pass through to freedom. In the book of Exodus, there is that curious detail that's something so apparently important that God gives the instruction 9 times. It's when God is instituting the feast that commemorates the liberation, the feast of Passover. After God explains how the Jewish people are to eat a lamb and use its blood to paint the lintels of their doors to signal where they live, so that the angel of death that is coming for all the firstborn of the Egyptians will pass over their dwellings. And you heard me read this earlier, but just to emphasize, so God is saying, this is a day you are to commemorate, and the 7 days you should do this, and for 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast. Anything who eats anything with yeast in it, and all this stuff about yeast. In the first month, you are to eat bread made without yeast. For 7 days, no yeast is to, okay, we get it. It's like, Mom, before you get in the car for the big road trip, did you go to the bathroom? No, did you go? Are you sure you went? Yeah, Mom, we went. It's not just God, though, with this unleavened bread and this yeast business. Moses also gets into it. In chapter 13 of Exodus, as he's reminding the Israelites of their duty to remember what God has done for them, liberating them, he tells them that during this observance for 7 days, they shall eat no leavened bread. He says it 5 times in 4 verses. Why? Well, I'm going to venture an interpretation. When the opportunity for our collective liberation comes, we must be ready to move and move fast. God in this story is saying and saying and saying again, you don't have time to wait for the dough to rise. Grab something you can eat on the way and let's get going, because I'm making this happen now. Matzah, the unleavened bread of Passover, is a symbol of the conditions required for liberation, chiefly responsiveness and actual action. I'm glad that it's available year-round in the market now, so I can remember seeing it, that the Freedom train is always boarding, even if I choose not to get on board. I'm waiting for the bread to rise. We have to have another few meetings, or half a dozen meetings, or do another survey, or form another task force. We must listen to lobbyists represent their powerful employers' interests. Of course, that's only fair. Process, process, process. It doesn't seem unfair that those oppressed by the powerful have no representatives, no lobbyists. Nobody thinks of them. We have all the time in the world. Let's discuss this for another decade or so. We're hanging around waiting for the bread to rise while God is urging and urging. I'm doing something here. You don't have time for that. Passover reminds us that to be truly free is not only to be free from something, it is to be free for something. Something that magnifies our souls and demands of us our whole heart. Freedom is not a gift granted once and finally, but it is a process. It is a calling. It is a demand not only for me and mine, but for thee and thine. Grab some matzah for the road. Pack up the children. Quickly, let's go. The work of collective liberation is not comfortable, but costly. But we seek it with joy because we know, in words sometimes attributed to Mahatma Gandhi and sometimes to that wonderful author known as Anonymous, no one is free when others are oppressed. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go.